The First Council of Nicaea is one of the most significant events in the history of the Christian Church, and it would affect European history for years to come. This is the messed up truth of the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. What this means is that bishops from the entire known world of Christianity came together for the first time to discuss major issues affecting the faith. At this point in history, the Christian world consisted mostly of Southern Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. Still, that's a lot of bearded dudes in pointy hats. The council was convened in 325 CE by Emperor Constantine the Great, generally regarded as the first Christian Roman emperor. He held the council in the ancient city of Nicaea. While not literally every bishop in the world was actually present, tradition holds that 318 attended, largely representing the eastern portion of the church. Notably absent was Pope Sylvester I, who did at least send a few representatives on his behalf. Constantine called the council together in order to address issues of division within the church. He hoped to reestablish peace religiously, as he had just done politically by defeating his imperial rival Licinius. Before diving into what the Council of Nicaea was, let's take a look at what it definitely wasn't. A popular and oft-repeated myth is that Constantine and the Church Fathers decided which books would become biblical canon and which books wouldn't make the cut. This myth got a huge boost when Dan Brown repeated this myth in his wildly popular but historically dubious bestseller, The Da Vinci Code, which, if we're being honest, spent a lot of time selling people on a lot of fake ideas. However, this particular myth predates Brown's novel by centuries. The 18th century French satirist Voltaire quipped that the bishops picked the books of the Bible by placing all of the candidate texts on a table and seeing which ones fell off. The fact is that there is no evidence whatsoever to say there was any single council at which the church leaders decided what was real and what was fake. Rather, the canonization of the New Testament was a centuries-long process of debate and analysis. Over time, certain texts were elevated because they were believed to be written by the disciples of Jesus, were the correct age, and contained proper orthodoxy. Even today, the Protestant, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, and Ethiopian Orthodox churches don't agree on which books are canon. So the idea that this was decided in 325 is preposterous. That brings us back to what the Council of Nicaea was actually about. A number of different issues were discussed at the meeting. The primary concern, though, and the main cause of the division within the church, was the issue of a priest named Arius of Alexandria, especially regarding the increasing popularity of his ideas among Christians in Alexandria and beyond. Arius espoused a theological doctrine that was extremely troubling to the more orthodox priests and bishops at the council. His beliefs, which had come to be known as Arianism, was an attempt to rationalize the relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son. If Jesus is the Son of God, that means God came first. A pretty logical conclusion, you would think, but standard dogma makes things a little more complex. The idea of Jesus being God's Son implies that there existed not really a time, because God predates the concept of time, but rather a division of persons between God and His Son. And a circumstance where God existed before His Son means that Jesus is not eternal. Arius' belief was that if Jesus was born, only God the Father exists without origin. This goes against the Gospel of John, which identifies Jesus as the Word, who was with God in the beginning and was God. To most bishops, this was heresy and could not stand. The distinction between Jesus being begotten by God rather than being made by God might seem like an extremely minor nitpick from a modern perspective. However, to the early church, which had only just gained legitimacy after centuries of persecution, nailing this one down was incredibly important. Arianism is a Unitarian doctrine in the sense that it focuses on the uniqueness of God at the expense of the core Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, in which God is expressed as three distinct but individual aspects. For Arius, the fact that Jesus had to be created meant that he must be subordinated to God the Father. To a mainstream Christian at the time, this was a denial of the divinity of Christ. That denial makes it seem like Arianism would be shocking to most Christians, and yet Arianism was incredibly popular in both the Western and Eastern halves of the Roman Empire. The Council of Nicaea wasn't even the first attempt to stop Arius. In 321 CE, the Bishop of Alexandria convoked a council of 100 bishops to denounce Arius and his doctrine, yet he continued to gain followers until he was driven out of Egypt. Then he went to Palestine and recruited more followers. It was at this point that Constantine made like Gary Oldman in The Professional and decided to hold the biggest council ever.
Bring me everyone.
What do you mean, everyone?
Everyone!
Possibly the most famous name among the bishops in attendance was Nicholas of Myra. If that name sounds familiar, it's because St. Nicholas is who many credit as the original inspiration for Santa Claus. As the story goes, while Arius vigorously defended his views of the Trinity on the council floor, Nicholas got so upset by the repeated heresy that he stood up, strode across the room, and decked Arius cold across the face. It was illegal to strike anyone while in the presence of the emperor, and as told, Nicholas was stripped of his episcopal office and placed in jail. The legend continues when that night, the Virgin Mary and Jesus appeared before Nicholas and freed him of his chains and returned him to his bishop's robes. Upon hearing about this, Constantine reinstated Nicholas as the Bishop of Myra. Even if we ignore the parts about the ghosts of Mary and Jesus busting St. Nick out of jail, is the assault of Arius true? Unfortunately, there's little evidence to support the attack. Some accounts of the council list Nicholas among the attendees, but not all of them do. In fact, the ones that include him date from much later, and the story of the punch doesn't show up until about 1,000 years after the council. Additionally, the original version of the tale says he hit an Arian, not necessarily Arius himself. It's still a great story, though. The bishops at the Council of Nicaea wanted to make a definitive statement about their denunciation of the Arian belief that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father. What resulted was the Nicene Creed, the first clear and universal statement of Christian belief ever officially issued by the Church. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the creed was altered a few times to respond to newly arising forms of Arianism, but most were variants on the statement from Nicaea. The version that stuck was confirmed at the Council of Constantinople in 381 CE. Many elements of the creed exist specifically to counter Arianism, like this passage, for example. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, and born of the Father before all ages, God of God, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial to the Father, by whom all things were made. The key ideas here are that Jesus was begotten, not made, that he was true God of true God, and that he was consubstantial to the Father. Being consubstantial was a term at the crux of the arguments at Nicaea. Consubstantial means that Jesus was made literally of the same stuff that made God. So were the Father and the Son created from the same stuff? Nicaea says yes, as do most modern Christians, given that the Nicene Creed is still used today in Catholic, Orthodox, and most Protestant churches. While the Arian controversy was the major issue addressed by the First Council of Nicaea, it wasn't the only one. Believe it or not, another big topic discussed by the bishops was determining when Easter took place. At face value, this might seem like a silly topic, but do you know what date Easter is next year? Can you name it without Googling it? You can't. You can't, liar. In the beginning of the faith, the date of Easter had been tied to the Jewish observance of Passover. However, the bishops of Nicaea didn't want their holy day to be beholden to a Jewish holiday because, anti-Semitism. So while the church had originally held Easter on the Sunday nearest Passover or even on Passover, the new rule was that Easter had to be held on a Sunday and could not be on Passover. So the attendees settled on the most logical solution. Easter would be held each year on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. You're not wrong if you're thinking that sounds more like some sort of Wiccan business than Orthodox Christianity, but here we are. The process for determining these dates in advance is a formula known as computus, and though that sounds like a Legion of Superheroes villain, it's actually the Latin word for calculation. As a result, Easter always falls somewhere between March 22nd and April 25th. Well, in the Western Church. Eastern churches still use the Julian calendar, which is a topic for a whole other video. Arius wasn't the only troublemaker that the early church had to deal with at the Council of Nicaea. The bishop Meletius of the city of Lycopolis in Egypt was causing problems of his own. Meletius was a high-ranking bishop, second only to Peter of Alexandria, and this is what made his misconduct and insubordination so troubling. Conflicting sources make it difficult to discern exactly what Meletius' main crime was, but the central issue seems to be that he was unwilling to accept back into the church Christians who had renounced their faith under torture by Roman persecution. While most bishops were eager to accept those who repented of such action, Meletius refused. Even after being denounced as a disturber of the peace, Meletius continued to gain support. He ordained those who followed him, even from outside his own diocese, which was absolutely forbidden. At the time of the Council of Nicaea, the Meletian Schism, the name given to his breakaway church, included dozens of bishops and priests. They called themselves the Church of Martyrs. The council tried to make peace with Meletius by allowing him to remain a bishop, but demanded that he quit ordaining outside his diocese. It ultimately didn't work out. His followers sided with the Arians and existed as a separate sect until the 5th century. The results of the Council of Nicaea included Arianism being denounced in no uncertain terms. Arius started the council with 22 bishops in his corner, but ended with only 2. What's more, Arius and his remaining supporters were exiled to Illyria in the Balkan Peninsula. Then Constantine ordered that all of Arius' writings be burned and that anyone found with copies of his texts be put to death. Those severe actions were seen as necessary for the church to keep from self-destructing at a pivotal point in the history of Christianity. One of the long-lasting consequences of those decisions by the council was that it set a precedent for the emperor to use his authority to establish and enforce church rulings. If Constantine could declare that people must believe a specific concept about the nature of God or be put to death, then that has startling implications. The council marked the first full swing of the pendulum for Christianity. In a handful of years, it had gone from a forbidden and persecuted religion by the empire to one inextricably intermingled with it. It built a society where the emperor himself ruled based on theology, and ruled over theology as well. This tangling of church and state would subsequently be at the heart of European history for centuries, and pitted popes and kings against each other in their quest for power. A commonly repeated factoid about Constantine the Great was that he was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. Constantine is well known for his dream-inspired conversion in which a Christian symbol led him to victory in battle. Following that came the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal within the Roman Empire. This rule led to the building of some of the most famous churches in the world, including St. Peter's Basilica and the Hagia Sophia. Constantine also, of course, convened and oversaw the First Council of Nicaea, a pivotal moment in Christian history. However, by the time of the council, Constantine hadn't even been baptized. This, despite his professed conversion following his prophetic dream some 13 years prior. Constantine would not, in fact, be baptized until he lay on his deathbed in 337 CE, believing it was best to be forgiven of his sins as emperor all at once. There is actually a great deal of evidence that suggests that for most of his life, Constantine worshipped the sun. The Arch of Constantine, a triumphal monument that stands to this day, was built after his official conversion but bears no symbols of Christianity. It doesn't even have the Cairo symbol to which he attributed his famous victory. Instead, only tributes to the god of the sun can be seen. It's more than likely that Constantine didn't truly care about the theology of the Council of Nicaea, he only sought peace. Even if the Council of Nicaea established a centuries-long link between church and state and was overseen by someone who likely didn't actually care about the religious controversies at hand, at least it succeeded in wiping out the Arian heresy and the Meletian Schism, right? Actually, no. In the years after the council, Arianism crept its way back into popularity to the point that Constantine even started to tolerate the Arians. In fact, the priest who baptized Constantine on his deathbed was Eusebius of Nicomedia, an Arian. After Constantine, there were a number of Arian emperors, including his son Constantine II and Constantius II. Soon enough, the tide turned, and many of the bishops who had excommunicated Arius were themselves excommunicated, including Athanasius, who had been the Orthodoxy's most stalwart defender at the council. It took until the end of the 4th century for non-Arian emperors to finally quash Arianism within Rome. That wasn't the end of it, though. Arianism was extremely popular among the Germanic tribes that ended up sacking Rome, and it remained so until well into the 7th century. And as already mentioned, the council failed to suppress the Meletian Schism too. Meletius' church lasted over 100 more years. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about world history are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.